Good afternoon. I'm Guy Smith. I'm Deputy President of the National Farmers Union, but at heart I am a simple Essex peasant that, like you, tries to eke a living from the noble art of agriculture. I think we're all conscious that life is always interesting, but it's even more interesting at the moment. I'm not going to start second-guessing which way Brexit is going to unravel. People often say to me, come on, Smithy, you've got a close view of this. You move around in the right circles. And I can tell you that the view close up is the same as it is far away. I don't think anyone is very clear. However, as farmers, we stick to the task in hand, but we are mindful of the volatility around us. I think we're all conscious as farmers that this issue of crop protection, it remains much discussed. We're aware that our access to crop protection materials is important going forward. As farmers, we would never suggest that we can't see beyond the chemical can. We are always inventive. Every day we use non-chemical means of controlling pests, weeds and diseases. However, we're also conscious that if we increasingly lose access to crop protection materials, then life becomes more complicated and it may be we get less competitive against farmers in other parts of the world. I'm very mindful that just as we debate endlessly in the UK and the EU the future of glyphosate, the rest of the world carries on using paraquat, something that was banned 10 years ago in the UK, and it's still aerially applied in many parts of the world. So it's clear there's a regulatory divergence going on, and our concern at the NFU is that farmers are being placed at a competitive disadvantage because we don't have access to the crop protection materials we need, and the impact of that will be simply to export food production to those parts of the world where there doesn't seem to be this endless political NGO push to restrict the way farmers use pesticides. But at the same time, we recognize that these materials are increasingly scrutinized. We need to get clever and intelligent in the way we use them and the way we explain their use. And we need to always to be mindful of those non-chemical means of control. So, accordingly, we have three excellent speakers that I think may give us an insight into the way things are going. I hope that you as practitioners on the ground will take something away, which will make you a little wiser than when we started. So first up, can I invite Dr. Chris Hartfield, who is, I know Chris well, I work with him regularly. He is the Senior Regulatory Affairs Advisor at the NFU, our Plant Health Advice Team. Christopher, thank you.
Thank you, Guy. Right. I was at a conference a few weeks ago where we heard from a colleague from New Zealand, and he was talking about the challenges and the changes that that industry had gone through in the last 40 years or so. And his take-home message for us in the UK regarding Brexit was to make sure that we don't waste a good crisis. So while I came up with this title for the presentation here about crop protection post Brexit, I think maybe I ought to have renamed it, actually, How Not to Waste a Good Crisis. Now, it won't come as any surprise to you that the NFU is not a great fan of the EU pesticide regulation. And Brexit should basically provide us with an opportunity to do something different about all those things we don't like about that regulation. It should provide us with an opportunity to create better UK pesticide regulation that's different, that's more enabling, that's more pragmatic, that's more efficient. And we think that can be done, and we think by doing that we can achieve a threefold win. The first is to basically observe the EU regulation in a way that continues to enable trade. The second is with respect to continuing to maintain health, consumer and environmental protections. But the third, as Guy alluded to, is actually to create something better for farming businesses. I guess in the long term, a successful Brexit could look something like this. Basically, we've taken the current square peg of the EU regulation. We've carved off those bits of it that we're not particularly happy with to create a rounder, smoother UK regulation that delivers a less precautionary, more holistic, more science-based approach. I think the pressing question for us all and for our members is, when's this going to happen? What's going to happen in the short to medium term? Is it going to look like this? I think this is probably the cliff edge that government and industry wants to avoid. I think what we're more likely to see is this. Basically, as a result of the Withdrawal Act, which is there to basically ensure that there's no change to the principles of policy as it's transferred from EU regulation into UK law, basically what's going to happen is the square peg stays a square peg. It's just going to change colour. And we will continue to be relatively aligned, certainly in the first instance, and this will hopefully enable a fairly smooth transition. Now, the big question is, though, is how long will this alignment continue? When are we going to be able to realise some benefits of leaving the EU? When are we going to be able to realise that Brexit dividend? Now, the NFU, we're going to be working hard to ensure that those changes take place as soon as possible. Now, in the area of pesticides policy in particular, we don't have to wait years before seeing those changes that would benefit farmers and growers. There are some major issues that we'll have to park for a while. However, there are problems with the EU regulation that's not necessarily lines of the regulation, but more about the way it's implemented here in the UK. And they could provide some early opportunities for change. We see that our farmers are already at a disadvantage with some of the crops compared to their competitors in the EU. And this could be down to differences in the current regulation and the way it's implemented in different member states. It could also be in the way that different pesticide products are supported in different countries by manufacturers. So we think this could be countered by taking a different approach to implementation. And this would be realised in that short-term period during an implementation phase to bring UK farming businesses in line with their competitors in the rest of the EU. I'm going to illustrate this with the example of hops. You might think this is a bit of a niche crop, why are you talking about hops? But along with vineyards, it's quite an interesting example because these are expanding sectors in the UK. They're both sectors that have a very significant export opportunity. Because we're talking about wine and beer, they also have an obvious interest and a particular appeal. But both of those sectors are actually kind of nearing crisis point in the UK with respect to crop protection and having an effective toolbox of pesticides. Now, on the last count, in Germany, there was around 36 actives available to you if you're a hops grower. In the UK at the moment, there are about 23, but about 3 of those you can't use if you're exporting to the US, and that's a major export market for UK growers. And interestingly, if you compare that with the USA, they have only over 60 actives available to them if you're growing hops. So the problem here isn't so much just the number of actives available, it's the gaps that it creates in your armory. And for example, in hops, there's only one effective acaricide that is available. Actually, sorry, there's no effective acaricide available in hops. There's only one broad-spectrum insecticide, and that's lambda cyhalothrin, and that's restricted to use only at the base of the crop, below 50 centimetres. And with hops, this is an 18-foot high crop that you're dealing with. Of the aphicides that are available and that are allowed to be used, the rate that's allowed in the UK is lower than the rate that is used in the rest of the EU, and that causes problems, not only in trying to control your pest in the first place, but it can also cause problems with respect to resistance management. So this all basically adds up to a pretty uneven, unlevel playing field, and this challenge certainly isn't unique to hops. So, when we think about a new UK regulation for pesticides, what are the key objectives of that? What would we like to see? Well, basically, actually, a good starting point would be the existing EU regulation. because the aims of that at a high level are to ensure protection of human and animal and health and the environment. They're also to improve the functioning of the marketplace for plant protection products. But actually, a high-level aim in the EU is also to safeguard the competitiveness of European agriculture and improve agricultural production. It's just a shame that the EU seems to have forgotten about that high-level aim. Now, thinking more specifically about the kind of principles, don't expect to read all of these, but these are the kind of principles that we'd also want to see reflected in a UK regulation. We don't want the UK to be disadvantaged by the Brexit process. We want some alignment, but not identicality with regulation in other countries. And this is a pragmatic way forward that will hopefully continue to enable trade. We want clear, credible, science-based risk assessment. We want a faster, pragmatic decision-making process. And we believe that in the UK, the regulator can deliver decisions that the EU, it could deliver those decisions in probably less than half the time that it would take the EU to deliver those decisions. Basically, all of these things listed here, what they do is they contribute to a more predictable UK pesticides regulation, more certainty in regulatory outcomes, and that creates stability and opportunities, hopefully, that will incentivize innovation in crop protection and investment in crop protection. And this is something that we have seen that's particularly been undermining and lacking in the EU regulatory process. Now, it's not all bad, the EU regulation. There are some parts of it that we'd like to keep. Our own competent authority, CRD, the Chemicals Regulation Division, it's very effective, very influential. We'd like to keep, as much as we can, that influence. We like the ability to be able to mutually recognise use and authorisations in other countries, currently just EU member states. Maybe we could look to extend that beyond Europe. We want there to be a good provision for minor uses and specialty crops. We like the emergency approvals process. You know, it's right that we have a mechanism where we can bring products to control new pests that have invaded the UK, and we have a mechanism to rapidly respond to that kind of issue. We want to keep the focus on integrated pest management, and we want to retain CRD's level of expertise. It's basically CRD are at the top of the pile with respect to all member states in Europe, in the amount of work that they get through and in the efficiency of their processes. Some of you may have seen slides similar to this before, but what it basically demonstrates, the UK is over here at the end. The UK gets through a far greater volume of pesticides authorization and regulatory work than any other member state, and it delivers this to pretty good and efficient timelines and deadlines. As we leave Europe, it's this kind of capacity that we need to harness here in the UK. But there are things we don't like about the EU pesticide regulation. I've already touched on a few of them. The hazard-based cut-off criteria. We don't like the way it holds back innovation. We don't like the way that it has a zonal approach that should really deliver benefits for us all, but it basically doesn't work properly. So there's a whole range of opportunities, and whether or not we can realize these and when we can realize these, that's basically going to be down to the nature of our Brexit deal. And I'll be picking up on some of these more later. But there are some very big challenges going ahead. And at the top of that list, I've put culture change. I think it's one of the greatest challenges for us here in the UK. Some of our problems with the current regulation aren't lines of the regulation per se, but the way in which it is implemented in the UK. So we need to realise a more enabling approach for agriculture. And that's going to require a culture change in government departments and driven down through its agencies, CRD, HSC, all the way through. But that culture change has to start at the very top. We need to maintain our ability to influence. I mean, we may not have a vote, certainly during an implementation period or transition phase, but we will still have a voice. And we need to make sure that certainly right up until we leave, that we continue to have an influence in Europe, and after we leave, that we have as much influence as we possibly can. Transitional arrangements are a big area of risk. This is the implementation phase, or the transition period, where we could see a very close alignment with EU regulation up till the end of 2020, maybe even beyond that. But that's a big risk, because basically we're mirroring EU regulation with very limited ability to influence the decisions that are being made in Europe. Devolution is an obvious risk. You'll be very familiar with that. Not just the challenge of Northern Ireland and the border there, but basically, there's a risk here that we could end up with something different from what's happening in Scotland, what's happening in Northern Ireland, what's happening in Wales. We have devolved governments. I mean, reassuringly, the signs are from government is that they're talking about the general principle where we're continue with an UK-wide approach. But we don't want to move out of this dysfunctional relationship with 27 other member countries to then move into an equally challenging one with devolved governments within the UK. Guidance documents are a big area of challenge. I mean, it's guidance documents that are at the root of the neonicotinoid bans. They're basically the instruction manuals that tell people how to implement the regulation. And the principle of guidance documents is it's supposed to get all those 28 member states basically working in the same way with respect to the regulation. When we come out of Europe, clearly we won't need to harmonise in that way. And that could give us some opportunities and some flexibility in how those guidance documents are used. And then the last one is about being black in to be in the green, which is something we increasingly talk about. We need a UK regulatory framework that delivers for businesses, that's enabling, that safeguards the competitiveness of UK farming businesses and improves production and profitability, because ultimately businesses need to be financially and economically sustainable in order to be environmentally sustainable. So we're in the 11th hour, really, with respect to Brexit now. There's still a huge amount of uncertainty as to where we're going to end up. But there are some general principles here that we know. The closer the UK and the EU are in terms of their trading relationship, the closer the regulatory alignment is going to be. But whatever the outcome, whatever the deal that's finally struck, it's essential we continue to seek out these opportunities. And here are some of the key ones as we see them. It's building on that UK expertise, taking that rigorous science and evidence-based approach to all the work that's done within the UK. We think there are opportunities to do proper risk assessment around the decision-making on pesticides. This is something that the EU roundly fails to do, and we see the consequences, and we have to live with the consequences of that. But this is something that we could do within the UK. Improving timelines is one I've already mentioned. As I say, we could more than halve the time it takes, for example, to bring a new active to the marketplace. So one of these companies here could bring a new active to the regulator to go through the assessment process. It could give it to the UK regulator at the same time as it gives it to the EU regulator. But basically the UK regulator, because of the efficiency which it processes these things, can get through that in less than half the time. So you guys may have it available on the marketplace maybe 2 years or more ahead of your nearest competitors in the rest of the EU. There's opportunities to increase flexibility, to create a level playing field, about being more proactive, about actually horizon scanning, looking for those critical gaps in the crop protection armoury. It would ask, what are the key control gaps? Where don't we have an effective pesticide? Is the option to go forward, is it a chemical option or not? If chemistry is the answer, what are the options? What is the chemistry that's required? So we've kind of tinkered with looking at this kind of approach. The industry and government and HSE, CRD have worked really well on controlling a new pest called spotted wing Drosophila in horticultural crops. And it very much took this horizon scanning proactive approach to actually be on the front foot, have some effective insecticides available before the pest even turned up in the UK. So there's examples of where this can work well. We can look at more wider global cooperation. As we move out of the EU, we don't just have to cooperate with the EU now. We can look to close cooperation with other regulatory authorities around the world. And we could be radical, but we're talking about medium to longer timescales for the more radical stuff like addressing hazard-based cut-off criteria. So, this is my final slide. just to sum up, how are we going to basically change, how's Brexit going to change things around crop protection for farmers and growers? Well, there's still a lot of uncertainty. That's for sure. You don't need me to tell you that. But what's very clear is right up to the point of exit, we need to keep engaged in the process, in that decision-making process. We have a vote right up to the point of exit. After we exit, during an implementation phase or a transition period, we need to continue to try and be as influential as possible and still have a strong voice in Brussels. We need to grasp those early opportunities that I've talked about, building on that pragmatism, the efficiency, and the science-based approach of the UK regulator. And then the short to medium term, we need to look at some of those other opportunities around like the kind of more holistic horizon scanning approach. But lastly, I'll just bring you back to that kind of key challenge that I highlighted, that culture change. I think to realise any of these opportunities, to deliver a UK pesticide framework for pesticides that achieves that triple win of continuing to protect consumers and the environment, of basically enabling trade, but thirdly, doing what the EU couldn't do, and that's enable competitive and productive agriculture, we need a culture change within the government departments and agencies governing pesticide use, and that culture change needs to start from the top and being driven all the way down. But I, despite all that, remain optimistic that a lot of this is possible. Thank you.